You found it. Your home for the best content on your favorite team, the Fighting Tigers of LSU. Do us a favor. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your comments below. Be sure to smash that like button. Let's just sort of empty the notebook, everything we were able to see. Pretty unprecedented. First time in about a quarter century, LSU had an open practice that was entirely open to the media. We got in about 9:45, pretty overcast. Rains came late. They wrapped things up just before noon, and at which point we got to chat with Brian Kelly. So about 2 hours out there watching LSU practice. A lot of individual periods. It was not a scrimmage. Individual periods, and they did team periods as well. We also got to watch some special teams. So we'll run through a lot of this here to start the show, and it'll take a couple of segments, so we'll get to a lot of your reaction as well. If you'd like to join, feel free to do so. First things first, let me not bury the lead. Garrett Nussmeier, Brian Kelly. Here was Brian Kelly giving an update on Garrett Nussmeier, who was limited today.
Just had a grade 1 ankle, so just limited today, but he'll be back probably taking 7-on-7 reps either tomorrow or Saturday. So very, very little. He's done a really nice job. So he just came down very similar to when, a basketball player comes down on somebody else's foot, very similar situation. And, he's recovered quite nicely. So just a minor ankle situation for him.
All right, so Brian Kelly giving an update on Garrett Nussmeier. Basically, when they were doing just throwing drills, like standing still and throwing, Nussmeier participated. When they did anything that required him to be on the move, he did not participate. He just stood in the back, and Jayden Daniels primarily took the first team reps, which is kind of what we've seen at this point. No Jack Besh. Chris Hilton showed up later in practice and just caught balls from the quarterbacks on his quarterback-only drills. No Jordan Tolles. Derek Davis was also absent. It was interesting. It was very interesting to watch a full practice, to take a bunch of notes from practice, and then immediately after practice to go listen to Brian Kelly, hear what he had to say about the things that we just saw and observed and what our opinions were. I thought about breaking this down offense, defense. Instead, what I'll do is kind of go through chronologically what we saw, and I'll make some observations as such. Right when we walked in, the offense was inside, the defense was outside, and the defense was kind of doing a pursuit drill. So initially, we got to look at what would be, you would think, the first-team defense, because you saw Ali Gay, you saw Mason Smith, Jaquelin Roy, and B.J. Ojulari on the line. But that's where things get a little interesting, because the first linebackers we saw out there were West Weeks and Greg Penn. The nickel was Greg Brooks. Your corners were Jarek Bernard-Converse and Colby Richardson, the transfer from McNeese, who got a lot of run today. And then your other safety was Major Burns. So there were, it was Major Burns and Mekhi Garner was on the field as well in a nickel. So there were, right off the bat, some very obvious observations there. I'm going to come back to that because the thing that stood out most defensively is they are going to be multiple, not only with their looks, but with their personnel. Again, I'll get to that in just a quick second. When the offense came out, the quarterbacks were doing target practice. Basically, they were around, maybe the 10 or 15-yard line, and there was a big target that they would put in the corner of the end zone, and the quarterbacks were essentially trying to hit the target. I mean, they were just throwing the ball at the target, 2-3 shots at a time, and then they would rotate. The biggest observation from that, I think all of them looked good. They were throwing against air, and if you're a college quarterback, you should be able to hit a target in the end zone. But Walker Howard, I think, was the biggest takeaway. If you put all four quarterbacks on the goal line and just had them throw the ball as far as they can, Miles Brennan may have the best arm in that respect, but release, accuracy, zip, that's Walker Howard. Brian Kelly spoke about Walker Howard after practice today, and you could tell he's excited about him, and there's a lot of potential there just physically in his ability. So that was cool to see. We saw the wide receivers going through sort of a catch-through contact drill where they'd have to, there were coaches with dummies that were hitting the receivers as they were trying to catch the ball and then had to make their way back through, basically catching through contact. And most notably, the order was Butte, Kyron Lacey, Jeray Jenkins, Malik Neighbors, and Brian Thomas, then the walk-ons. So as we mentioned, no Besh, no Hilton at that point. And what stands out is obviously what we've talked about. You are top-heavy at receiver. You got a lot of really talented guys there at the top. And you just don't have a lot of great depth at receiver. But the guys we saw today, I thought looked really, really good. When they went to the team period, and I'll get into some specific plays and some guys that stood out. So they were still running individual. They go into a team offensive period, and this is where everybody was kind of taking a look at the offensive line, as you might expect. And the offensive line we saw on Monday was the same offensive line we saw on Thursday. Garrett Dellinger was back at center. Will Campbell, Tremont Shorts was your left side. Your right guard was Miles Frazier, and your right tackle was Anthony Bradford. So the same line that we saw on Monday. What was a little bit interesting, Charles Turner did run as the second-team center, and the rest of the second-team offensive line was the same. So it was Dumerville at left tackle, Emory Jones at left guard, Turner at center. You had Cardell Thomas at right guard and Cam Wire at right tackle. The two players that we saw cycle through were Marlon Martinez, ran some with the twos at right guard, interchanging with Cardell Thomas, and then at right tackle, it was Kimo Makaneoli, rotated with Cam Wire at second string right tackle with the twos. The team periods were interesting because we kind of got to see a little bit of a thud, and it was good on good. I mean, it was offense against defense, and they were in full pads. They were not tackling to the ground, but you got to see them run plays, and you got to see the defensive line get off against the offensive line, and you got to see the quarterback elude pressure and make throws under distress. Now, they weren't, there was no contact, no tackling, I should say. They weren't hitting the quarterbacks, but a couple of things. Running backs, John Emery, Noah Kane, Josh Williams, and Armani Goodwin. That was the order, and they all rotated fluidly. Like, all got reps with the ones and the twos. I mean, that was the order, but they just kept going no matter what line was out there. Same with the quarterbacks. When they went to team, Nussmeier stepped back and did not participate, but Daniels, Brennan, then Howard took reps, and then it was just they went and repped it that way. The offense, I think, there was a couple of plays that stood out. One of them was probably the play of the day, was a beautiful touchdown pass that Miles Brennan threw to Brian Thomas. It was down the right sideline. Brennan took the snap. He had a clean pocket and lofted a ball down the right sideline to Brian Thomas, who absolutely dusted poor guy. It was the freshman. It was Jalen Davis Robinson, who's the freshman cornerback out of Texas, 5'11", 185. That was the play of the day. The line held. Miles threw a beautiful ball down the right sideline, and Brian Thomas had his guy beat by 3 steps and took it into the end zone. That was a gorgeous play. It was interesting to listen to Brian Kelly after practice talk about Brian Thomas as well. This was interesting because you see the ability there, but Brian Kelly is pretty candid. We're learning in the way that he's addressing the things that his players need to work on.
He'll be a contributor. He needs to be a key contributor. There's a difference between a contributor and a key contributor in the sense that, as I look at it, the consistency of performance has to be such that he can step in and be a starter for us. I think at times, he still thinks he's a freshman, and he's not anymore. And we need for him to understand that it's time for him to go in there and think like a starter. And that's maturation, and he's getting there. We like his work ethic. He's very, very strong. He's actually, when we look at our numbers in terms of strength in the weight room, he's one of our strongest players. It's amazing what his raw physical ability is. Sometimes this is just a matter of maturation and coming along and actually probably making a play or two in an SEC game. And once he does that, I think you'll see this continue to grow.
So that was probably the play of the day offensively. I'll tell you 2 others. One, Walker Howard was in at quarterback, but the play, it was a block from Emory Jones. Emory Jones was at left guard, running with the twos, and he was up against Jacoby and Guillory. Walker Howard was at quarterback, and this was a design quarterback run. It was snap and roll left. and there was 2 tight ends to the left side as well. So they started to the right, 2 tight ends moved to the left side, so you were heavy to the left side, and Emory Jones pancaked Jacoby and Guillory. I mean, it was like, oh, okay. I mean, the whole place kind of went, screamed and kind of oohed at that. Emory Jones also was on the first team with the punt unit as a protector. So it's very clear Emory Jones is going to play. He is not going to redshirt. He has got a role on this team. I'm not telling you to be as a starter, but they like him. He is physical enough, and he is going to play. If you're watching, that's the block where Emory Jones pancaked Jacoby and Guillory. It was a massively impressive play. And the third, I will tell you, was an individual play by Jayden Daniels. Garrett Dellinger did really well with the snap, except on one play when it started to rain. Brian Kelly kind of made a joke about that in his post-practice press conference. But it was Jayden Daniels did a really good job. It was a low, wide snap. Daniels reacted, tipped it to himself. The rush was coming. He eluded the rush, rolled right, and threw a ball over the corner to it was Kyron Lacey on the sideline who was slanting toward the sideline. It was a beautiful play, and it's actually it is descriptive of how and why you're going to see Jayden Daniels pop, why he has a skill set to do what they want. He can elude the rush. There was a beautiful play where Jayden Daniels, when the pocket broke down, broke around the right end and ran for about 15 yards. That's the dynamic that he brings to this offense, and it's pretty clear that's the dynamic this coaching staff wants. So it was very interesting seeing that dynamic. I want to talk a little bit more about the defense, and in particular what I kind of described as what felt at times like a turnstile. And maybe this was intentional. Maybe it's they are just throwing a lot at a lot of different guys to see who stands out and who rises. Or maybe they legitimately plan on using all of these guys. I mentioned when we first walked out and they were doing a pursuit drill, your 2 linebackers were Greg Penn and West Weeks. Now, when they went to team and it was ones-on-ones, your first defense looked like this. You had Ali Gay at one end. Your interior linemen were Jaquelin Roy and Mason Smith, as we know. B.J. Ojulari is not playing defensive end. He's playing the jack linebacker position. Brian Kelly talked about that. You'll hear that in a second. The only stand-up inside backer that was on the field when they went first-team defense was Mike Jones. So you had Mike Jones and then B.J. Ojulari, but Ojulari was playing the jack position on the end. Your outside cornerbacks were Bernard-Converse and Mekhi Gardner, so 2 transfers. The nickel back was Greg Brooks, and then your safeties were Jay Ward and Major Burns. That was your first-team defense. It felt like literally every play, one of those guys rotated out, and somebody or somebodies new were on the field. We obviously saw a ton of rotation at linebacker with the 2 guys I previously mentioned. You had Micah Baskerville rotate in there as well. We're going to have to get used to Desmond Little, who's wearing number 8 when B.J. Ojulari got 18. Little's wearing 8, who Kelly talked about. You hear that in just a quick second as well. We saw Joe Fouché playing deep safety. We also saw him playing box safety. We saw LaTerrence Welch run with the second unit. We saw Sage Ryan run first and second team. They had so many guys in the secondary, really at the second and third levels, both at linebacker and in the secondary, rotating so fluidly that it was almost impossible to keep up with who was actually in what unit. It wasn't like, okay, first team, you're up. Okay, second team, you're up. It was, aside from your defensive line, where there is very clearly a first unit that's going to be out there, everything else felt very fluid. Let's start with what Brian Kelly said about the linebackers. And by the way, I want to phrase the way this question was asked, and it was Leah Van from The Advocate who said, look, it seems like your first few guys at linebacker are set. And she mentioned Mike Jones and Greg Penn, and I believe West Weeks was the other that she mentioned. And Brian Kelly actually kind of disagreed. And based on what I saw, I think Brian Kelly is right. They have a lot of guys they're counting on right now.
Obviously, Harold Perkins can bring to that group. We've seen some, obviously Weeks is part of that. You mentioned Penn. I think that group continues to show, some depth there that wasn't there early on and maybe wasn't there even in the spring. So I know talking to Matt just the other day, he's very encouraged with the depth. We really like what Micah's doing too, Micah Baskerville. I know you didn't see him a lot today, but he's going to be somebody that helps us this year as well, and really like his football IQ and his smarts. So I think when you finish evaluating the linebacker position, I think there's 6 guys there, a minimum, that can play winning football for us.
It's interesting that he kind of had to prop up Baskerville at the end. We know Micah Baskerville can play. For whatever reason, he has not emerged in this defense. And I don't know if that's a timing thing, if it's a skill set thing, whatever it may be. But it is very clear B.J. Ojulari is going to be your starter at that jack position, and Mike Jones is going to have the inside spot, and they're going to rotate a lot of guys. And I believe him when he says they have 6 guys they feel like can play winning football, because we saw all of those guys taking reps with behind that first line earlier today. Now, the other thing about the defensive line is, and this is where Brian Kelly talks about Desmond Little. This is number 12. Because Little came in as a linebacker, but the way that they are structuring this defensive front, they're moving parts. I mentioned Ojulari's playing the jack position, and that's actually allowed them some depth, as you'll hear Brian Kelly say.
I think there was a little bit of concern on the edge. I think we felt really good about the defensive tackle position and the big end position, starting with Roy and Smith, obviously feeling really good there. And then, building out with Ali Gay, that right there is a very formidable group. BJ, playing the jack position, we wanted a little bit more flexibility, and Desmond Little has had a really good camp for us. And that's given us, a big lift, because we were considering maybe that we would have to, look at maybe Ali Gay playing, both positions and giving us a little bit more. But I think with Desmond playing really well at that jack position, it allows us to solidify that group. Now it's just a matter of continuing to build the depth.
So they're not a 4-3. This is not going to be a 4-3 defense with 2 tackles, 2 ends with their hands in the dirt, and linebackers behind them. That much is abundantly clear. He told you he said the big end spot, and that holds, because when the second unit ran out there, you saw Jacoby and Guillory and Mekhi Wingo as your tackles, and the big end you saw Savion Jones run out there as well. I mean, and whoever was that jack position, Desmond Little. So you kind of got to look at what they're thinking about what their front is going to look like. But they ran a lot of nickel and dime, so sometimes you had like 1 true linebacker on the field. Sometimes it was 2. So that was maybe the big takeaway. Desmond Little stock rising because that's a name you got to get to know, because of what they are specifically wanting their defensive front to look like and the skill set of the guys they plan to use. So get to know that name. And then there's the secondary, where we all know Stingley, Ricks, McGlothern, Flott, all gone. I mean, you basically lost you had 2 scholarship cornerbacks for the bowl game. They had to go address that. And I'll tell you, there were a couple of guys today who saw a ton of action. One of them is Colby Richardson. I don't know if Brian Kelly mentions him in this cut. He said his name a couple times in the press conference, but called him the wrong name. He called him the wrong name a couple of times in the press conference. Colby Richardson is a transfer from McNeese. He wears 22, and he got a lot of run today. Here was Brian Kelly on the secondary.
Really pleased. I think it was one where I think we all didn't know what to expect, but, whether it be younger players, older players, all of them have really shown in camp. Seven Banks is now cleared for 7-on-7, and we see what his ability is. We didn't have Jarek Bernard-Converse in the spring. Now he's out there. Mekhi, so an area where we were concerned has now begun to look like one of great depth. Major Burns being back brings a guy with a lot of smarts and savvy. So I just feel right now that the concerns that we had there are starting to be alleviated by the production in the play.
when you have a guy, that's a great way to put it. When you had concern, you added bodies, and you could talk about, well, you've addressed it because you've added bodies. That's very different than seeing it on the field. And look, a lot of plays that we saw, especially there was a time at practice where they were running a receiver DB drill. They did go 7-on-7 later, and during 7-on-7 is when Brennan threw the beautiful touchdown pass. But they were running just quarterbacks, receiver routes against DBs down around the goal line. They set up around the 5, inside the 10-yard line, and they were running a variety of routes. If you go look at my social media, I got a touchdown, real good video of a touchdown that Jayden Daniels threw to Cole Taylor over Major Burns. It was a beautiful play where Taylor went up, high-pointed a ball, came down, got his feet in, held the ball through the ground. It was a really nice play. But you saw a variety of plays as well. There was a crossing pattern where I thought Jay Ward did a beautiful job getting underneath of Nick Storrs and batting down the ball. It was a crossing pattern in the middle of the end zone. You saw those DBs win a fair amount of battles as well. Mekhi Garner won a one-on-one with Kayshon Boutte. You don't worry about Kayshon Boutte. You know he's going to be spectacular. You want to see these guys, as Brian Kelly said, perform. You want to see them go out there and get their share of wins, because then it's not just guessing or thinking it's addressed because you've had added bodies and guys who have played at different levels of football. They're actually going out there and showing you they're winning some of these one-on-ones. And so there was a really good bit of that. There's so much more that I want to get into. One more, though, and actually, let me just very quickly go through just to kind of put a button on the practice report itself. We'll get to more what Brian Kelly had to say a bit later, but we did get to see special teams. Your punt returners look like right now Sage Ryan, Seven Banks, Malik Neighbors, and Javen Nicholas are the 4 that are taking reps right now, returning punts. Seems like Jay Bramblett has the lead for the starting punting job. And as far as place kicking, Brian Kelly said there is no separation whatsoever there as of right now. We did get to see our first look at Debert and Mata and those guys with the place kickers on the far field. But quite honestly, most of our time, I think, was spent watching the quarterbacks, the offensive line, the secondary, the linebackers, the places where there are position battles that is going to draw them the most interest. But it was interesting to watch these guys catch punts and the way they did the drill. Like, they started with their back to the punter, and then the coach would tell them, all right, turn, and they had to find the ball in the air and then haul it in. And then Brian Kelly started throwing like a second ball at him as well. So they're working with those guys, but it looks like your punt returner is going to be one of those guys, either Sage Ryan, Seven Banks, Malik Neighbors, or Javen Nicholas, who's a freshman from Nicholas is a freshman from St. Aug in New Orleans. Where's number 33? Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact, and be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.